Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. I want to talk about the Korean War now. I had mentioned it earlier, but I want to longer, maybe a multi series talks on the Korean War. And based upon my book here, The Korean War No Victors, No Vanquished. Okay, I think that pretty well sums up what how the war eventuated in the end. No one won and no one lost. Um, so, and I want to begin at the beginning, of course. And Korea was known as the um, Hermit Kingdom, and it developed a completely different, well, not completely, but very different society from that of Japan. And several times Japan had tried to conquer Korea. And in the first invasion attempt, the Koreans developed a series of ironclads. Now, these were wooden ships propelled by sail, but they were covered by iron. They called them turtle ships. And they defeated the Emperor Hideyoshi. So several times Japan has tried to take over Korea. But the Koreans were isolated. The United States got involved in Korea in the middle 19th century, the 1860s, when shipwrecked mariners, Americans usually, but sometimes others, would be washed ashore in Korea and they'd be killed. And then, of course, the complete opposite of the way that international law, how sailors are to be treated. It's adjusted better here. And so we sent a small-scale punitive expedition to stop bombarding the Korean forts along the Yalu River, not the Yalu, no, the river that goes through the capital, Pyongyang, as it was then. And but after that, Korea remained pretty much isolated. But Japan had gone through, at roughly the same time, a period of really dramatic, one of the most dramatic transformations in modern times. Had gone from a feudal society, the age of the shogun and so on, and the emperor being a figurehead, to a relatively modern, in a sense, completely modernized country in a period of 2 or 3 decades. And so Japan was really feeling its oats by the 1880s and was putting pressure upon Korea, trying to open it up. And Japan continued this rapid modernization, more modernization in a technical sense than they weren't exactly a parliamentary democracy, although they had a diet. And in 1904, 1905, to the complete astonishment of all of the military experts and all of the thumb-sucking experts, civilian experts, and so on, Japan defeated Russia. I'd spoken before about the overrated Russian army. They'd been defeated just earlier, well, several decades earlier in the Crimean War. And so the Russian defeat was both at land and at sea. The Battle of Tsushima is a classic. It's a battle which naval officers had studied for years and years, and I suppose still do in many respects, at the naval academies of the Western world. And then they defeated in the Great Battle of Mukden, a kind of a forerunner of the First World War. And I say they were completely defeated. So Japan was really feeling its oats. And this was a great age of imperialism. And Japan was, well, modern countries are imperialistic and will be materialistic, imperialistic now as well. And so they began to, I would say in its unofficial way, began to dominate Korea, putting pressure upon it and so on. Koreans, of course, they still consider themselves a superior civilization and very much the Hermit Kingdom, and didn't want this. So the Japanese finally said, well, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. And they killed the Emperor of Korea. And then 1910 basically took over Korea. And a point I want to make here is that when we talk about the word imperialism, that's very bad, and I'm not going to argue with that. And of course, it's what European and America did to other countries. It's as a white imperialism. Well, I'll tell you, the Japanese, when they went into imperialism, they did it with the same gusto and force and meticulous planning that they did when they modernized themselves. They just basically took over Korea and ran it exactly as Europeans would run, like the British ran India or Nigeria or the way the French did French West, French Indochina, whatever, in which they ran the country basically, but they would allow indigenous peoples to be, like, for example, school teachers, um, minor uh, province officials, maybe, and they also did not interfere with the Korean election or education system. They, they developed some fairly good universities there, but when the graduates would come out, their prospects are rather limited. Okay, there were jobs for them, but not above a certain level. Koreans were inducted basically into the Japanese army, but they couldn't become officers. The same thing with the first British Indian officer in the British Army. It was got his commission in 1917. I mean, he'd been in India for since well, unofficially since the 1780s or so, but that's the same sort of thing. They really are a miniature um, reproduction of European colonialism, but I would argue maybe even more brutal. You could almost say they raped the land. Most of the trees were chopped down. You don't think of Korea as a forested country, and rice paddies and whatever. Well, it was at one time fairly well forested, and they chopped it all down because Japan didn't have that many forests and wood and so on. And it's again typical of you could argue the positive aspects of imperialism, which imperialists would argue about and did for many years afterwards. Well, we built up the country. In the British in India had a wonderful railway system. I mean, weren't like us ripping up half your trains and your passenger trains, and then no, they still run the Indian railroads, or made by the British. There weren't any railroads in India before the British got there. And for example, what the Chinese, the Japanese did in Korea, along the Yalu River, the border between China and Korea, they built this massive hydroelectric plant. It supplied power for all of Korea and probably beyond that in southern China, or not southern China, but China, where China bordered onto Korea. As a matter of fact, that was the hydroelectric plant that we were constantly trying to bomb during the Korean War. But I jump ahead. And this prevailed, I would say, brutal. I would say the Japanese were more brutal in Korea than the British were in India or Nigeria, or the Belgians were the Belgians are pretty bad in Africa, but other than most Europeans, the French and French Indochina, for example, where you have the country ruled by the mother country, they call it, and we call it the metropolitan country, and but slots for people down the level. Like maybe you have Korean locomotive engineers, but people who ran the trains in Korea would, of course, be Japanese. Well, this system prevailed. There's actually a revolt. You have that in almost all these colonial countries. They had a revolt in 1920, which, surprise, surprise, the Japanese put down brutally. Okay, and so from about 1910 really through to World War II, Japan was busily exploiting Korea. Now, how did we get into Korea? Well, at the end of the war, the emperor finally said we must cease resistance now and must face the unfaceable and endure the unendurable. And so at the same that Russia had just gotten into the war, the Soviet Union had just gotten into the last 4 days of the war, and boy, did they reap benefits from that. They moved eastern Russia. They transferred most of the troops from the Western Front, the Germans had surrendered, into Manchuria, or the Eastern Front of Russia, and then down into Manchuria. I'd say 5 or 6 divisions at least. And so at the same time, the Americans saying, well, look, let's figure what we're going to do with Korea. The Japanese are there. They're surrendered. We got to repatriate them. We got to and they weren't to say stop the Russians, but I think that's kind of what they're thinking of. We've got to move in there. And so we did. Later in August 1945, we sent two divisions into Korea just to occupy the country. And so the Koreans welcomed the Americans because the Japanese were an easy act to follow. And we repatriated all the Japanese back to a major mass movement, by the way, throughout Asia, repatriating all the Japanese military and colonial forces and everything back to Japan, which is a good thing, but just hadn't made that many more mouths for the Japanese to feed. But that's another story also. So we moved in the southern. We landed at Busan, and then pretty well started taking over things. Now in Washington, we're saying, well, now look, we got the Russians up to the north, and we're moving to the south. We don't want the two forces to collide. I mean, that's like a military battle, but there could be incidents, whatever. And so we two officials of the State Department got out a National Geographic. The only map they had apparently at the time was a National Geographic map. And they drew a line halfway through it. Okay, give half to the Russians, half to us. A temporary arrangement, of course. Things will settle down, and then Korea will emerge as itself an independent country, which it certainly ought to be. And so that temporary line, it just went right across. They didn't take time to say, well, now let's not cut right through this village, or let's not cut this coal mine in half, or whatever. We'll just straight across. That line that they drew is still the line between the People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, the People's Republic to the north, and the southern region, which was I forget the exact Republic of Korea, ROK, but that comes later. And so I one of the points I often make when I talk about the United States after the war was a good thing that we did. The occupation of Germany and Austria. I was there after the war in both countries, and as a child, of course, not an adult combat division descendant. But we put those two countries on the road to what they are now: prosperous, wealthy. One of the modern democracy in both countries. The people we've been trying to kill just a few years earlier, now they're building them up. And I've always, it's kind of, that's one thing we did right in America. Matter of fact, MacArthur said that what he wanted to be remembered for was bringing democracy to Japan. Not that he ruled Japan, and no, that he brought democracy there. Apparently that's what is on his tombstone, what he's the most proud of. But in South Korea, where our forces were, it was a real foul up. We had the commanding general was a sort of small bore MacArthur. He wore the sunglasses, apparently even smoked the corncob pipe, and it was not a very competent commander. And we just didn't seem to get it right. We basically treated them like they were as though they were an occupied country. And the Koreans indignantly said, well, look, you freed France, right? And now France, you pulled your troops out, and now you've got France. But don't you think we were victims of the Japanese as much as the French? We were occupied by your enemies, the Japanese, for longer than the Germans occupied France. But as soon as we restored order there in France, France becomes France again. But us, we're still Korea still, but they have occupied forces there. So it was not, and I have this in the book here. It was not an occupation that we could be proud of. And what also happened, a lot of people Koreans who had collaborated with the Japanese were put back into positions of power. This was a dilemma we did face in Austria and Germany, but somehow we managed at least to get the trains running and everything. And without not always using Nazi collaborators, but in this case it was. And the Americans said, "Well, we don't have that many qualified people who are Korean nationalists." But I think we kind of used that as an excuse, and so it was a pretty bad situation. A lot of food shortages, and then power shortages and so on. Most of the power plants, I said, were in the north, so that didn't help either. Although at first, of course, the Russians did allow power to be sold into southern Korea, one called South Korea yet. And so, but here's the other thing: there were refugee flows, and almost all the refugees came from north to south. And it makes me think that, well, north must have been hell on earth, because things are really fouled up in South Korea. But the refugees, I think, an important point in modern history: which way do the refugees flow? So, oh, we screwed up here, and we weren't very good there. Well, where are the refugees? As in the Korean War and so on, always from the communists to the Western powers. Well, in 1948, the Russians said, well, we're leaving Korea now. We want for Korea to go on its own, so we'll pull out. And so, somewhat embarrassedly, the Americans a year later, oh yeah, we're going to give you your emancipation, if you will, or freedom from occupation. And so in the north, it was the Democratic People's Republic, always the same, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the Southern Republic of Korea, the ROK. And so both of them said, well, we're the real Koreans. The others are just puppets of the, well, the people aren't, but everybody, the whole government of South Korea is just American lackeys. And we'd say, well, the North Koreans, they're just lackeys of the Russians or the Soviets. And back and forth began to develop combat, large scale, kind of large scale raids. The North would raid the South, and the South would raid the North, because both of them said, we're going to unify this country. And that includes, it wasn't just the communist North, the South as well mounted major raids across the 38th parallel. And some say that the South Koreans were more aggressive than the North. I don't know about that. I've done a fair amount of research on that, and it's a lot of just skirmishes, but also fairly large scale. And both of them had we're going to liberate in South Korea. The Pukchu, that means advance north. And the leader of South Korea was a Western-educated Korean named Syngman Rhee, who had been fighting abroad against the Japanese for all those long years of Japanese occupation, and we put him in power. And we, when the Republic of Korea emerged, now there was an election in 1949 in 1948 in Korea, and it was certified by the United Nations that this was a legitimate election. Now, I think Syngman Rhee was an authoritarian, so I think there was a fair amount of ballot stuffing and, beating up your opponent and that type of thing. And there was another prominent South Korean leader who was assassinated, Kim Koo. And there was some thought that maybe he had been assassinated under Rhee's orders. So this is the way it's developing. And in the North, of course, it's a completely the People's Republic, but obviously very under Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung was a member, had been in the Red Army during World War II, and then was moved. The Russians saw a good person who would follow orders, and they put him in charge in North Korea. And that's where matters stood on the 25th of June, 1945. Oh, I should make one other point. For some reason, there was no really anything from the South Korea in terms of border raids and so on. And I think what happened here was North Korea was, North Korea was not doing anything to the South. And I think what they're doing, they were saying, okay, these minor raids aren't going to get us anywhere, because it didn't encourage the South Korean people to rise up or anything. So we've got to just go for the whole enchilada and take over South Korea. So on 25th of June, 1950, the North invaded the South. Now that's pretty much, we all agree. Well, actually, there's some academics say, no, that's not the truth. It's a story. It was some people have advanced the thing that, well, this was a North Korean raid, and the South Korean army fell apart so quickly. Said, well, golly, let's just go for the whole thing. Now, I think that's almost a contemptible point of view. It has no sense of logic, but that has been advanced by some American academics who should know better. Matter of fact, there were two British observers, UN observers, along the border, and they were saying that they weren't exactly pro-South. They said Syngman Rhee is a tyrant and whatever, and that there's not real democracy in South Korea. But they said no. The North they almost caught us. I mean, we had to get out of there. We were right on the 38th or just south of the 38th parallel. So anyway, and some would say, well, then actually it was a South Korean raid that went bad, and North Korea said again, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Well, the fact is, the South Korean army, half of it was on leave at the time on the 25th of June, 1950. So if you're planning a major invasion, I don't think you put half your army on leave. And so the North Koreans rolled south. Now, what they had as a great advantage was about 100 Soviet tank T-34s, T-34-8, I think was called, an updated version of the magnificent tank that the Russians had in World War II, the T-34. And the South Koreans had no tanks, okay? I think they had a few armored divisions, armored vehicles, and that's about all. And their air power was just some light trainers, small propeller-driven trainers, while the North Koreans had World War II actual fighter planes. So the South Korean army really was reeling against this kind of advance. I mean, they were taken by surprise. They were attacked by tanks, by air power, and there are instances the South Koreans say, no, we didn't just fall apart. But at least just looking at the map, things were going. A terrible thing happened as they were evacuating Seoul in the wake of the invading North. And the bridge across the Han River was just packed with soldiers, refugees. They blew it up. And the engineer who blew it up was shot for this because it left so many South Korean forces on the wrong side, on the side of the Han River through Seoul that was being taken over rapidly. So they continued to move south, and of course, all this had a very great effect on Washington. I remember when it happened, it just came out of nowhere. Because Americans, they don't know where Korea. Winston Churchill said, "I don't know where the bloody place is." Okay, now he may have been exaggerating. I don't know, but that was an opinion where is Korea? And Truman had met with his advisors and questioned, what are we going to do now? This is all out straight invasion in a strategic part of Asia. Well, most parts of Asia are considered strategic. What are we going to do about it? You see, originally, we had no defense agreement with Korea. As a matter of fact, in 1949, just before the Korean War, Secretary of State Dean Acheson had drawn a line, like these are the parts of Korea or of Asia that we'll defend. Like the line, of course, went to put Japan on the line. We're going to definitely defend Japan. And it left Korea in kind of always the forgotten kingdom, the hermit kingdom. Well, we're just going to say, let's see what happens in Korea. We didn't bother. I don't know if they even forgot to put it in this defense perimeter. So, which many scholars say that encouraged Kim Il-sung to say, well, the Americans aren't going to come in, so let's do it. And there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff we didn't know about till many years later. But Kim Il-sung, he was all for it, let's invade. And Stalin and Mao Zedong, who had just won the civil war in China, were saying, well, go ahead, but if you get in trouble, don't look to us. And he said, oh, don't worry, because when we go across the border with our liberation, all the South Koreans, they'll rise up and, they're, death to the fascists and the Syngman Rhee government. And it wasn't quite like that at all. Actually, our official line was that the North Koreans are puppets of China. And, I say this, Kim Il-sung was no puppet. I mean, he typically, in a way, Korean. You're very strongly nationalistic. And so at any rate, they had to make a decision on what are we going to do now. And Truman said, we've got to stop. They used the argument of Munich. See, we could have stopped Hitler. And most historians would agree with that. We could have stopped Hitler 1938 or whatever, even later than that, because he, in fact, when he crossed in the Rhineland, the troops that went in had sealed orders. If the French move against us, you move back. We said, oh, they've just invaded the Rhineland, and when we can't open, it's almost heartbreaking to see what opportunities the British and the French had in 1938, 39 to stop Hitler. In fact, there are numerous high-ranking German officers that said, this guy's going to lose the war if he could start, and we're going to get rid of him, have a coup d'etat or something. But after Munich, well, there you go. So we said, we're not going to do that again. We may have to risk a small war to avoid a big war. And so within days after the invasion, U.S. troops were sent to Korea. I said, well, how did? Well, see, Japan is close enough. We flew them over in C-54 transports, and they landed at Seoul, and then I'm sorry, they landed at Busan, the southernmost port of South Korea, and then they were sent by train to the front lines. And this is where we get into the Battle of Osan for the first American troops in battle for the first time since 1945. You'd think, boy, after the horrors of World War I, people would be thinking twice about going to war. But apparently Kim Il Sung, he was all for it. And to be fair, Korea was not devastated by World War II, and Kim, didn't have to experience that sort of thing. But I think that's a good place to stop here. The entry of American troops into combat in the Korean War. And I just want to point out that my book here, The Korean War, No Victors, No Vanquished, that was published in 1995, the University Press of Kentucky. So it's got some scholarly backbone to it. Did a lot of original research on this. So anyway, the next time we get together, I will deal with the beginning of the American combat in Korea. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.